Okay, so just to kind of put ourselves back in the picture, because we had a week's break with Rosh Hashanah, we basically looked at, so far kind of been marching through our study of Sefer Yonah on three legs of a four-legged table. Meaning, we started with Yonah and went through the first three chapters, where ultimately saw the basic theme of the book is Yonah fighting against the concept that God is going to offer a chance for the people of Nineveh to do tshuva and be forgiven. He's being sent to Nineveh to tell them to do tshuva, otherwise they're going to be destroyed. But that otherwise means that it's conditional. They could do tshuva and they could escape that fate. Yonah doesn't want to participate in that mission, and so he tries to run. We had a discussion whether he's running from God or running from running from God or running from the prophecy or the mission that God was giving him. And he is struggling with that concept that God's compassion can be applied even to the people of Nineveh. God, in a sense, instead of punishing Yonah, goes chasing after Yonah to the sea, so to speak. Yonah goes into a boat, and God sends a storm. Yonah goes down to the base of the boat, and the people of the ship toss him into the sea, and then he gets swallowed by a whale. And God is constantly engaging with Yonah to try, not a whale, sorry, my slip of the tongue. It's not a whale, big fish, and God is constantly struggling with Yonah to try to teach, to engage Yonah in, and there's this conflict between them, so to speak, if you can have a conflict between a Navi and God, over the role of God's rachamim, or compassion. That led us to the study of Moshe's experience with a similar concept, although based partially in the text, partially in the Medrash, in which Moshe also seems to struggle with the notion of God's compassion. He's not quite sure the boundaries, the parameters of when to apply the principle of din and punishment or rachamim. We saw this in the context of the story of the golden calf. Moshe's on the mountain, and on the one hand, he punishes the perpetrators, and there's an element of din. On the other hand, he asks for the forgiveness for the people, and so you have this struggle. What is the balance between them? And ultimately, God reveals to him what we know as the 13 attributes of mercy, and we'll look at that a little bit more again today, in the sense that these are the midot of rachamim. But he also tells Moshe that these are beyond the ken of the human being, that ultimately it is God's parameters to decide at the to the notion of that God will delegate that compassion in a way in which we don't necessarily always understand. This is reflected in the Medrash that says Moshe went up to heaven and said to God, he saw God writing the midah of erech hapayim, slow to anger, and he said to God, slow to anger meaning for the good, for the righteous, and God said, no, even for the wicked. The wicked should perish, says Moshe. God says, there will come a time when you will need to defend even the wicked, and that happens later in the context of the sin of the golden calf, and similarly also in the sin of the spies. And so we have this dilemma of not always understanding when God's compassion versus God's midah of judgment or din balances itself out, and ultimately we ask for forgiveness. We leave that balance in the hands of God. We don't always understand how it operates. That led us to the third pillar of our discussion, which is the story of Eliyahu, because Eliyahu also seems to have that same kind of dilemma. We actually expanded it into a kind of a dilemma of nevuah altogether. The Nevi'im's role, the role of a Navi, was to essentially engage the people to a loyalty to God by recognizing, by being the spokesperson for God's attributes. When was God angry? When was he compassionate? And to apply that to the real world that we live in, that was essentially the role of the Navi. And so many times the Navi himself didn't always understand God's compassion. And the classic example was Eliyahu, who spent his entire career, the whole story of Eliyahu is essentially a declaration of intolerance, if you will, for the idolatry of Izebel and Achav. And God seems to tolerate that because the rain there is the symbol of that balance between tolerance and intolerance. It means God's compassion for the people is such that he continues to allow it to rain, even though the Torah stipulates that if you worship idols, there will be no rain. And Eliyahu takes it upon himself to be zealous for God and to apply the principle of din, to shut up the heavens and declare a drought. And that leads to a 3-chapter struggle that we looked at last week, or last class, which was 2 weeks ago, in which Eliyahu is perceived as the great kanoi, the great zealous prophet for God on the one hand. On the other hand, God is trying to convince him that this is not the time, that this is a time for compassion, this is a time for the kol d'mamad daka, the sweet still voice, not for the fire and brimstone that Eliyahu represents. That comes to a head, number one, in the showdown with the prophets of Baal and Har Carmel, but for Eliyahu it comes to a head in the very same cave in which Moshe Rabbeinu was shown the attributes of mercy. In that cave, God says to Eliyahu, Malach hapo Eliyahu, what are you doing here? And Eliyahu says, I was zealous for you, God. I declared a drought. That drought led him to Nachal Crete. That drought led him to the house of the of Surfat in Lebanon, where he was met the widow suffering from the drought and the child who died because of the drought. He ultimately expresses the need to revive that child and imbues that child with life, thereby demonstrating rachamim. God says, okay, well then I'll bring rain. Eliyahu understands none of this. He comes to the cave of Moshe, and in that very cave, God says to Malach hapo Eliyahu, what are you doing here? And Eliyahu says, I was zealous for you, God. And God says to him, this isn't a time for zealotry, it's a time for kol mamadaka. Asks Eliyahu again, that still small voice. He says to Eliyahu, Malach hapo Eliyahu, what are you doing here? Eliyahu again says, I was zealous for you. God says, if zealotry is going to define you, Eliyahu, you need to find your replacement. And he does. He appoints Elisha to his successor. And while it's not our subject for this series, just a plant in your head, an FYI, everything about Elisha is essentially not all, but almost everything about Elisha is essentially the same experiences that Eliyahu has, except that Elisha's role is to bring the compassionate, still small voice that Eliyahu could not or was unwilling to do so. And so we have these 3 anchors of Nevi'im, Yonah on the one hand, Moshe a little bit, Moshe's a bridge, but Yonah and Eliyahu certainly attributes of judgment, of din, of emet, of truth, who have struggled, 2 prophets who struggle with the concept of rachamim, both in terms of its application to Achav on the one hand, and its application to the people of Nineveh on the other. That's more or less where we got up to, and I promised this shir today we would kind of bring it all together and answer the question. Both, first of all, we haven't studied the last chapter of Yonah. I left that out intentionally, so we're up to chapter 4. Number 1, and number 2, to resolve the question, what is the reason we read the mafter of this book of Yonah in a couple of days' time on Yom Kippur? So let's now jump in. That's sort of a big summary of where we're at in the last 3 classes. And of course, reminds me always of the famous joke of the rabbi who gave an hour-long lecture and was asked afterwards, Rabbi, can you just summarize what you just said in 5 minutes? And he said, sure. And they said, well, then why didn't you? So there you go. That's the why didn't you. The last 3 weeks all summarized accordingly. All right. So let me jump into a share screen. You have the source pages in the link in the chat. And please feel free to jump in. And if you can, leave your cameras on, because I still see you, even though I'm sharing my screen. I still see you on my other monitor. All right. So where we left off essentially was this question of Eliyahu and the kanos, the zealotry for God. I wanted to share with you an interesting observation about that whole experience of Eliyahu. This is not really related to our study of Yonah, but it is a fascinating and a very important piece of the story. Everything we've said about Eliyahu in the last class leads us to an understanding that Eliyahu was this big zealot, that Eliyahu was this kanoi who killed the prophets of Baal and who went to war with Achav and who stopped the rains and declared a drought for 3 years, all because he was trying to defend God, who said that if you worship idols, I will punish you. Well, if God wasn't punishing you because he was too merciful, Eliyahu would punish them. And there is this moment in which Eliyahu declares to God, I was zealous for you because your people abandoned the covenant. Ki avru et britcha. Now, the irony of that phrase, that Bnei Israel azvu et britcha, abandoned your covenant, is picked up by the Medrash and by the Navi in a very unique way. Eliyahu serves in an additional capacity. We know from Sefer Malachi, well, we know from the Book of Kings that Eliyahu is one of the only prophets in Tanakh, only people in Tanakh, described as not having died a normal death, but having gone up to heaven. You're familiar with the story. Eliyahu goes up to heaven in a chariot of fire. Elisha watches, and Elisha is given the mandate to continue. But because Eliyahu goes up to heaven in that way, sorry, is there a question? No. Right. Because Eliyahu goes up to heaven in that way, Eliyahu becomes identified with this immortal persona or spirit that appears in various moments in history. The problem is that the moments that he appears in history and all the midrashim and all the stories and all the folklore paint Eliyahu in a very different picture than he's painted in Tanakh. In Tanakh, he's the great zealot. He's like a Pinchas character, which is why Chazal connect Eliyahu and Pinchas. He is zealous. He's willing to punish the people because of their idolatry, even when God is unwilling to punish. And yet, in all the stories about Eliyahu, he's always the compassionate one. He's always the one bringing the food, the miracle, the miraculous salvation at one moment to a family in need or to a person in need. Or, most acutely, we invite Eliyahu to every bris. We have a chair set up for Eliyahu at every bris. We have the Masorot is that we invite him to every Pesach Seder. So to understand that dynamic of Eliyahu, I want to this is a kind of a postscript to last week's class, but it's important and it'll help us understand a little bit of the transition in the rest of the shir today. At the end of the book of Malachi, Malachi is the very last prophet in Tanakh. Malachi lives the beginning of the Second Temple period, Chag HaZachaya Malachi. Malachi is the last chapter of Malachi is considered to be the close of prophecy. And in this last paragraph, Malachi says something very famous. He says, Hinei ani sholech malachi, I will send my messenger. Ufnei derech upinat derech lefanav, and he will prepare the way before the arrival of what we interpret traditionally to be the concept of redemption or Mashiach. Ufitom yavo lechalo adon asher atem mevakshim, suddenly the master who you seek will come into his temple. Umalach habrit asher atem chafetzim hinei ba. The angel of the covenant, or the messenger of the covenant whom you desire, will come. What is this Malach habrit? At the very end of this chapter, Malachi says the following: Sichu Torah Moshe Avdi, remember the Torah of my servant Moshe, which I commanded him on Chorev, reference to the cave again, to the mountain of Chorev, laws and statutes. Hinei anochi sholech lechem et Eliyah hanavi. Lifnei bo yom Hashem hagadol v'hanara. I will send Eliyahu, the prophet, before the great day of redemption, so that he can restore the hearts of children to parents and parents to children. Ve'yeshiv lev avot al banim ve'lev banim al avotam. Eliyahu's role here is one of mercy, is one of repentance for the people, one of inspiration, one of restoring the hearts of children to parents, parents to children, to unite generations. lest I come and strike the earth with a curse because of din, because of judgment. In other words, Eliyahu's role here is the exact opposite of everything we saw in Eliyahu's lifetime. Eliyahu, the Kanoi, who himself would come and bring a curse upon the land because of the people's sins, is here described as Eliyahu who paves the way, the Malach HaBrit, the angel of the covenant, who comes to pave the way for the restoration and the loyalty of the people before, lest God come and there be sin in the world and he will have to punish. So it's the exact opposite role that Eliyahu plays, which is fascinating. The transition between Eliyahu in Sefer Malachim, in which he plays this role of this master zealot who brings din into the world, to the role that he plays in Malachi, which is for all eternity to be the symbol of compassion and tshuva and leishiv levavot banim. It's a very it's like a 180-degree transformation. The Medrash picks up on exactly this. And the Medrash describes it, and it actually explains one of the foundation of why we have what we refer to as Kiseh Eliyahu, the throne of Elijah, at every bris, every circumcision. It's a play on the word Brit. The Brit that the Navi was talking about here, and the Brit that Eliyahu was talking about, was the Brit, the covenant, the entirety of Torah. The Brit that we're talking about in the Medrash is specifically the mitzvah of Brit Milah. It's the only mitzvah that carries the word Brit with it. So the Medrash says that at that time, God came to Eliyahu and said to him in that cave on Har Chorev, Eliyahu, what are you doing? And his answer was, Kanokineti, I was zealous. God said to him, are you always going to be zealous for me? You were zealous in Shittim, which is a reference to the story of Pinchas. You were zealous here, Kanatamakaneh, says God, Chayecha she'ein Yisrael osin brit milah ad she'ataro ebenecha. God says to Eliyahu, for eternity, you will bear testimony to the fact that Israel was loyal to the brit, to the circumcision to the covenant of circumcision, to the only mitzvah that carries with it the name, the word Brit. From here we have the custom to establish a chair for the angel of the covenant, the Malach HaBrit, which is Eliyahu, Zechulatov. In other words, Eliyahu, who accused Israel of abandoning the covenant, is now going to spend an eternity coming to every circumcision to testify before God as to the loyalty of the people to the very Brit or covenant that Eliyahu had accused them of abandoning. And that's, in a sense, it's a way of a punishment, but it's also a way of divine justice. Eliyahu, who goes up to Shemayim, who doesn't die, but who goes up to heaven in a spirit, in a chariot of fire, is an eternal figure. He is now going to spend that eternity defending Israel and their loyalty to the mitzvah Brit Milah. That's how the story of Eliyahu at every circumcision comes about, the transition between Eliyahu the zealot and Eliyahu the symbol of the Malach HaBrit, the angel of the covenant, is embedded in this Medrash Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer and embedded in these psukim that we have studied. And it's all because of that effort that God says to him, Eliyahu, I'm not going to let you remain a symbol of din and judgment. You need to come to, in a sense, to, let's call it God's side of the equation, which is God who defends the attributes of mercy, compassion, and who sees beyond what Eliyahu sees. Eliyahu sees them abandoning the covenant. God says, you will now see what I see, which is the loyalty, the other side of the equation. Which brings us back to a study of Yonah and our comparison between Yonah and Eliyahu. I want to share with you this statement in the Zohar, fascinating statement in the Zohar. Zohar, essentially, the Zohar in Parshat Vayakhel does exactly what we have done in the last 3 shiurim. It says that Eliyahu and Yonah share a common story. And what has become very common, very typical in today's kind of study of Tanakh, where we compare stories, compare themes, compare words, Here's the Zohar doing exactly that. In the context of Mi'al, says the Zohar, it's a pasuk Mi'ala Hashemayim, who went up to heaven, says the Zohar, who went up to heaven? The Eliyahu. Eliyahu went up to heaven. Eliyahu goes up in a chariot of fire in the book of Melachim Bet. Vayered, Mi'ala Shamayim Vayerad, who goes up to heaven and comes down, and came down. Who came down? The Yonah, that's Yonah. The Nachat Lenuga Goitahomi went down into the depths of the sea, Leimkeya. In other words, the stories share that contrast. Eliyahu goes up to heaven, Yonah goes down to the depths of the sea. And then the Medrash says, Yonah Michela de Eliyahu Ka'ata. Yonah comes from the strength of Elijah. Yonah was made possible only because of Eliyahu. Eliyahu Salik, Yonah Nachit. Eliyahu went up, Yonah came down. Dashal Nafshelememat, Eliyahu asked to die when he stood on the way, when he was running from Achav and Izebel, and he said to God, Kachat Nafshi, take his life. V'dashal Nafshelememat, and Yonah asked God to take his life after God forgave the people of Nineveh. And therefore, begin kach ikre ben Amitai. That's why Yonah is called ben Amitai, as it says of Eliyahu, the Isha the Amanah Hatzorfit, the widow, when Eliyahu revived her child, says Udvar Hashem beficha emet. God's word in your mouth is truth. The play on the words between Eliyahu being called the Navi, who represents truth, Emet, and Yonah ben Amitai, and Emet being an attribute of din, of judgment, in contrast to that of Racham. So you have all the pieces of the puzzle embedded in this one, encapsulated in this Zohar. Break it out, kind of unpack it, and I charted out just a handful of comparisons between the two, and we've seen these over the last couple of weeks. Eliyahu, it says, she says, the widow says to Eliyahu, God's word in your mouth is truth. Udvar Hashem b'ficha emet. Of Yonah, he is called Yonah ben Amitai, or the measure that says that he ran away because he was a Nevi Emet, and he didn't want to be accused falsely of saying to Nineveh, they're going to be forgiven, and then they'll do tshuva, and God will forgive them, and there's a certain tendency to look at the process of tshuva from the perspective of a falsehood, meaning, and that's what Eliyahu and Yonah were saying. Here, God says, if you sin, you'll be punished. They sinned, then they did tshuva, but people don't see the tshuva. They just see the fact that they sinned, and Yonah said they would be destroyed, and they weren't destroyed. So is Yonah a false prophet? Is Yonah lying? Right? That's the problem. Shekem and Emet, in this case, are very relative. Similarly, Yonah runs away. Eliyahu runs away, and he, after Achav and Izebel tried to kill him, after Har Kamel, the great miracle of fire coming down from heaven, they're unconvinced, so he goes and he runs. Similarly to Yonah, who ran away rather than fulfilling the mission to go to Nineveh. God runs after them, and that's the mystery of both books, both stories. God runs after Eliyahu. He sends him to Nachal Crete. He sends him to the house of the widow in Tzarfat to see the impact of his own decree of judgment. He runs God chases him to the cave of Moshe, enabling him to get there with 40 days and 40 nights of not eating. Right? There's a parallel to Moshe, parallel to the story. God runs after Yonah. Yonah chased him into the sea, chased him to Nineveh. Ask the question, why didn't God just punish the Navi? No, it's a conversation, it's a dialogue. God is trying to teach the Navi something in this story as well. They both ask to die. Eliyahu asks of God, Kach nafshi, take my soul, ki lo tov anochi mi'avotai, I have failed. And similarly, Yonah says, Kach et nafshi, ki tov moti michayai. Sorry, that's a typo. Forget that.
Doug is an anagram in English.
Sorry, say it again.
Of God, just like followed by not a fish, but by God.
Sorry, I didn't hear what you said.
I'm saying Doug, which swallowed Yonah, is an anagram in according to
Oh,
King James Version, God. He's swallowed
okay.
by God, just
All right.
as Elijah was swallowed by God.
All right.
That's what I deduce from your Chiddush.
Well, all right. I'm not going to get into the anagram about Doug, but all right. Eliyahu stood in that same cave of compassion, of rachamim, where Moshe saw the story of the attributes of God's mercy. And similarly, Yonah sat in a cave of compassion, of rachamim, when the gourd, the kayon that grew about him in the end of the story was like a cave that enveloped him, protected him from the shade. So Yonah was also in a cave. It's another subtle paragraph. God was critical of Yonah, of Eliyahu, Malach Eliyahu. God was critical of Yonah. Ha'etev chamalach. Is it bad enough for you? God tried to teach Eliyahu the midah of rachamim, kol dmama daka, still small voice. God tried to teach Yonah the attribute of rachamim. I shouldn't have compassion over Nineveh, the great city, 24,000 people, etc. Yonah the zealot, Eliyahu the zealot, neither accepts this concept. And so at the end of the story of Eliyahu is charged with the mission to appoint a successor, Elisha ben Shaphat, Timshach lenavi tachtecha. And Yonah, the Medrash says, was never given another mission after this. Shenit v'hidvar Hashem el Yonah shenit, shenit divrei Torah kim shlishit lo divrei Torah. God spoke to him a second time. This was the final mission and not beyond. So the parallels between Eliyahu and Yonah are striking. They're in the text, they're in the story, they're in the themes of the personality of Eliyahu, they're in the themes of the personality of Yonah. Now I want to show you something remarkable. If any of you were in our mini series on the study of Medrash, I shared with you the idea that sometimes Midrashim have a way of encapsulating biblical parallels by comparing by biblical stories or by comparing personalities. Pinchas is Eliyahu, which shares with us with insights, gives us the insight to the whole world of the zealotry of Pinchas and the comparison to the zealotry of Eliyahu. These are typical tools of Chazal. Everything we have studied we've talked about over the last 3 weeks in the comparison of Yonah and Eliyahu, and the notion that these are two prophets who share this drive to kind of defend God's justice by punishing the wicked or punishing the sinner, even though God is compassionate. Right? All that Yonah represents, which is essentially a retelling or a model of the same story of Eliyahu, is encapsulated in one phrase in the Medrash. Medrash methodologically abhors anonymous personalities in Tanakh. It's a methodology issue. The Hamli Butz talks about this a lot in her writings, that Chazal did not want to leave biblical personalities anonymous. In the story of Eliyahu, there is one persona who is not named, who is anonymous. And that is the son of the widow who died, and in Eliyahu's forced to contend with concepts of rachamim, brings back to life. Who is that child? Says the Medrash Tehillim, Medrash Achatov, Ben Sorfata Almana, Hu Yonah ben Amitai. Medrash says the child that Eliyahu brings back to life and imbues within him the core of Eliyahu's personality, story, and breadth is grows up to be Yonah ben Amitai. Chronologically, the two stories work because Yonah is 2 generations after Eliyahu, and in that one formulation, by suggesting that Yonah is the child who Eliyahu revives, Chazal throw at us the entire comparison between Yonah and Eliyahu that we have just unpacked over the last 3 weeks. So if you come away with anything from this year, it's the power of these kinds of very simple, very short midrashim that pack a wallop, that behind them stands an entire world of biblical analysis, text study, comparisons to understand the relationship between Eliyahu and Yonah. Okay, let's go back to the last chapter. Now we have to pull it all together. I entitled this shir "In Defense of God," or in God's defense. So we had Yonah struggling against God. We had Moshe struggling against God. We have Eliyahu struggling against God. What's God's answer to all of this? So let's go back to chapter 4. Yonah is disturbed greatly. He's angry. And he prays to God and he says, Ana Hashem, this is exactly why I ran away. This is why I ran. Because I knew, God, that you are slow to anger and abundant in kindness and patient with the evil, and you would relent and you wouldn't punish them. And we talked about that phrase. And therefore take my life. And this is where God's answer begins. In verse 4. Yonah, you angry? Are you really angry? Unclear what that means. Yonah goes out, and he goes and he sits on the east side of the city. There God makes for him a sukkah, and then he makes a little booth. And he sits under the shade of this booth. He wants to watch what happens to the city. So God sent a kind of a kikayon. I don't know what the kikayon is. It's a kind of it's described as a plant, a kind of plant, a gourd, whatever it is. He built around Yonah's, he put schach on Yonah's sukkah. This is an appropriate story to be reading at this point of time. He put schach on Yonah's sukkah. Yonah was very happy. It's a very hot day, like Eliyahu's, like Abraham Avinu sitting in the tent outside on the street. It's a very hot day, so a little shade was good. Next day, God sent a worm, and it uprooted the kikayon. Right? It ate away at the roots, and the entire gourd, whatever this schach was on his sukkah, dried up. The sun came out and shone brightly, like Abraham, God sent an east wind, deafening east wind, to strike at Yonah's head. To laugh, and Yonah was faint. Yonah was exhausted. Yonah was heat stroke and dehydration and the heat of the day. For the second time, he said, I want to die. I'd rather die than live. But notice the difference between this time and the first time. The first time Yonah asked God to take his life, it's because he couldn't live with the inconsistency between the din and the judgment and the tshuva and the false tshuva and the story of Nineveh. And it was very altruistic. Here, he's suffering from dehydration and sunstroke, and he says to God, I'd rather die because he's uncomfortable. Very different world. Are you angry for this kikayon? Meaning, are you suffering? Are you really angry because this kikayon is gone? He said, I'm very angry. God says to him, you pitied the gourd, the kikayon. You didn't toil, you didn't help it grow, you didn't work at it, you didn't plant it. You just happened to be overnight it came, overnight it perished. And suddenly you were suffering because the lack of this gikayon. I shouldn't have compassion of an Nineveh, the great city. 20,000 with more than 120,000 people. Who don't know between the right hand and the left. I should destroy them. And many animals. And that's where the book ends, with this seeming what we call a kal v'chomer. You were compassionate over the kikayon, which you didn't plant and you didn't grow and you didn't toil and you didn't invest in. I shouldn't have compassion over the people of Nineveh. And it ends with a question mark. The book of Yonah ends with a question mark. The truth of the matter is that it's a very odd answer to the question that Yonah asked. Yonah asked a very legitimate question. People of Nineveh did tshuva, but it's a superficial tshuva. It's because they were threatened with destruction. But by the day after tomorrow, Nineveh will become the capital of the Assyrian Empire and come and wage war with Israel. It was a very superficial tshuva and a very temporal and very temporary tshuva. Yonah's issue with the sun and the kikayon was a physical issue. He was hot and he was suffering and he was upset. But it wasn't a matter of rachamim, it wasn't compassion. Chasta lekikayon. The word lachus, chus v'rachamim, right? Chus v'chanenu. God to have compassion. The notion that Yonah had compassion over the kikayon, didn't have compassion, he pitied the kikayon. It was a convenience. It was shade. To compare that to the concept of God's rachamim for the city of Nineveh, the whole parallel here is striking. It's a kavachoma that doesn't work. We're using words that don't apply correctly to the context. You can't describe God's compassion for Nineveh as similar to Yonah's compassion for the kikayon. And yet that's what it says. You have compassion over the kikayon. I shouldn't have compassion over Nineveh. The whole thing is so odd. Here, Yonah altruistically asks to God to take his life because he can't understand that God should forgive these people. And then he asks God to take his life because it's a little hot that day and he forgot to bring his water bottle. The whole story here is extraordinary. So what's the answer? The answer, I believe, is the same answer God gave to Eliyahu. When Eliyahu stood at the cave and he says, I was zealous for you, God. And God says to him, Eliyahu, what are you doing here? Malachapo Eliyahu. And Eliyahu says, I was zealous for you. And God says, I don't need your zealotry. This is a time for still small voice. Eliyahu, can you get in line? Can you get in line with the message? Malachapo Eliyahu. God says to Yonah, Yonah, what are you doing here? Malachapo Yonah. What are you doing here? You think you can decide, you can figure out when God is going to be compassionate and when God is not going to be compassionate? You have all the answers? It almost reads like God's answer to Eov. God's answer to Eov is exactly the same story. You go to the book of Eov and you about if you go to the book of Eov, after 37 chapters of Eov cursing God and criticizing God and claiming that God is unjust and demanding a conversation with God, God finally, at the end of the book, engages Eov in a conversation. And Vayan Hashem et Eov minasara, God answered Eov from the whirlwind. What was God's answer to Eov? God's answer to Eov was, who is it that darkens counsel by words without knowledge. Gird your loins like a man. I will ask you a question. Now you tell me, Eov. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare. Let me know. Tell me. Who determined the measures of the earth, of the universe? Who stretched the line upon it? Who laid its foundations? Who laid the cornerstones? Who brought out the stars? Who brought out the solar system? Was it you, Eo? And it goes on. The entire chapter is a series of questions. Where is the way of the dwelling of light? Is the darkness? Where is its place? If you were there and you should know that you were born then great. Then you're an old man. Then let me know what the answer is. Do you know the time when the wild goats of the rock give birth, or can you mark when the hinds calve? Can you number the months that they fulfill? Or do you know the time when they give birth? Essentially, on and on and on, question after question that all relate to the way of nature. And essentially what God says to Eov in 3 chapters, 38, 39, 40, until finally Eov responds. And his response is, I am of small account. Hein kaloti ma'ashiveka. I have no way of answering you. And God says, okay, now you get it. Meaning, the entire book of Eov can be summarized in 2 words. You, with a small u, y, and I, with a capital I, big letter God, I. Meaning, the entire story is, Eov, who are you? Where were you? You think you can do a better job than God? You think you can run the world? You didn't create the world. You're a tiny little speck, and you're going to look at the entire universe and criticize God for 37 chapters because you think you can do better? And that's not an answer in the sense that it doesn't answer the question. It's a resolution of the book because it's essentially stops Eov in his tracks and says to Eov, there's a limit to how much you know and how much you understand and how much you can criticize in the world of God. Well, that's exactly what God says to Yonah. Yonah. You had compassion for the kikayon. You didn't toil over it. You didn't grow it. You didn't perish. It came today, gone tomorrow. And I shouldn't have compassion of Nineveh. Forget all the details. This kal v'chomer doesn't work. But essentially, the story here is 2 words. God says to Yonah, Ata, you are Yonah, who when it gets too hot and the sun is too strong and there's no shade, you're going to suffer. That's you because you're a human being. V'ani, and I, God, have a different calculus, have a different calculation. I have to worry about the world. I have to worry about the innocent. I have to worry about 120,000 souls. I have to decide to run the world. The calculus that God applies is not the same as the calculus that man applies. You have a very limited picture, Yonah. It's exactly God's answer to Eliyahu. Eliyahu, you don't understand. You're right, you don't understand. You're going to spend an eternity, God says to Eliyahu, coming to every bris so that you begin to understand. But that's the key to the story, is that Yonah ends exactly as Eov ends and as Eliyahu ends, even as God said to Moshe Rabbeinu, when Moshe asked to see this resolution of God's midot, and God said to him, Kilo yir'ani ha'adam v'chai, you can't see God and be human. It's not possible. There's the depth, the ata v'ani, it's not the same world frame of reference. And that's how the book ends. It ends with the same resolution as Eov and as Eliyahu, essentially a message that we can raise a question, but ultimately we are limited in the scope of our ability to understand. And so at some point or another, we have to accept. There's a certain I want to take us back to the source page for a moment. There is in this story a certain inconsistency in the concept of tshuva that is reflected in the words of Eliyahu, reflected in the message of Yonah, reflected even in Iyov. Because the notion that a person can live his life in a certain way and then come to God and ask for mechila and compassion and forgiveness, and God will forgive because that's God's attribute, that's God's the way in which he runs the world. There's a certain inconsistency. If a person sins, as the Navi said, nefesh achotati tamut, you should be punished. That will stop others from sinning in the first place. But it doesn't work that way. The whole concept of midot rachamim, of God's compassion, it's an inconsistency. It's a notion. It's a gift. It's a gift from God. It's not a given. And we don't understand it, but we rely on it. And that brings us to the famous Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, which I think we read or looked at briefly when we looked at the piece on Moshe Rabbeinu. But in this context, it's very important. God says to Moshe, God covered Moshe's face or he put in the cleft of the rock, and he with his hand, and he passed by, whatever that means. And Rabbi Yochanan said, if it wasn't written, we wouldn't be able to say this. It's as if God enveloped himself in the talus like a shliach tzibur, like a chazan. Moshe Seder Tefillah, and he showed Moshe the order of the prayers. And he said to him, Kol zman she'Yisrael chotin, if Israel sins, Yasu lefanai kaseder hazeh v'ani mochel lehem, let them do this order of prayer, and I will forgive them. And then you have this proclamation of Hashem, Hashem, Kel, Rachum, B'chanun, Rechavayim, V'rav Chesed. And the Medrash, the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah goes on to explain what each of these words represent. Yud Ke Vav Ke, God's name, twice, Hashem, Hashem, meaning Zani Kodem L'Shiach Ta'adam, I am there, God, our God, even before a person sins, and I'm there even for a person after they've sinned and they've distanced themselves. I'm there if they choose to come back. Not only that, says Rabbi Yehuda, and this is the key to the next piece, Brit kutal l'shloshes midot. God made a brit, God made a covenant with Moshe and Bnei Israel at that time over the authenticity and the efficacy of the 13 attributes of mercy, shenan chozot rekam, that reciting them is, we are promised, will not return empty-handed. As it says in that same passage in Shemot Lamed Daled, Hinei ani koret brit, I'm going to make a covenant with you. Neged kol amcha asani flot, I will do wonders before you. There's a brit over the proclamation of the 13 attributes of mercy. We mention this brit every time we say the Yud Gimel Midot, the 13 attributes of mercy during Slichot, or during Yom Kippur Davening. I'm going to say this a lot, especially at Kol Nidre and Ne'ilah. We recite the introduction to the Yud Gimel Midot. Kel Melech Yoshev HaKisei Rachamim, God who sits on the throne of mercy, who governs with kindness, mitnaheg b'chasidut, who forgives the sins of his people one by one, who increases compassion, even to those and pardons sins, who acts righteously with every human being, and then at the end of this paragraph, God, you showed us, instructed us to recite these attributes of mercy. Remember for us this day, Brit Shlosh Esrei, the covenant of the 13 attributes, because the notion, the promise that these attributes of mercy are relevant, are applied to the process of tshuva, was defined as a brit, koret brit. And that's precisely what the tension is in the story of Yonah. God is trying to defend, if it's kaviyachal, if you can say this, God is defending his right to be compassionate against the critique of Eliyahu and Yonah and Moshe, who said, no, God, punish them. God says, wait a second. Always punish the wicked, if always punish the sinner, then the world can't survive. There's a role for rachamim. We come to Yom Kippur desperate for that rachamim. The entire story is a story of God defending his right to apply the principle of rachamim where God chooses to. And we may not understand that. We may not agree even with the application because it means that the sinners will succeed in this world. Eliyahu was desperate to find the opportunity to punish Achav for his idolatry. But he only saw one half of the picture. Achav too had a good side to him. Achav was a wonderful king leader of the Jewish people. Achav gave his life to the Jewish people. Achav fought battles on behalf of the Jewish people. And so he had a flaw in his personality. He was idolatrous, right? Small little detail. But God saw the whole picture, and Eliyahu couldn't. That's the conflict. That's the tension. It's about God defending his attribute, the promise he gave us that the attributes of mercy are real and we can rely on them and we quote them and we engage with them. And that's what Yom Kippur is all about. We do it all through Kol Nidre and all through Ne'ilah. We recite these Yud Gimel Midot. We recite this paragraph followed by the 13 attributes of mercy. We recite them 7 times. And the original source of Yom Kippur davening, the original sources have slichot and part of the 13 attributes of mercy recited at every tefillah on Yom Kippur, not just Kol Nidre and Ne'ilah. There are some places still today that do that. So to sum up the...
Rabbi, yes. Could I ask a question? Hi, it's Sandra. Yeah. So thank you, but something that's been torturing me over the last few shiurim is it's almost such a cruel irony that we deal with Moshe and these last parshiot, and how he basically, for the last few parshiot, he begs God to let him see the land. He begs him to go into the land. God says no. God says no. And here we're dealing with a midah of rachamim, and I'm totally projecting this. But if I were Yonah, if I were Eliyahu, I'd say, God, these guys at Nineveh, the lowest of the low, the worst of the worst, and you're giving them rachamim, and Moshe, you're not giving him rachamim. I can't bear this. I can't bear this. And so I need to throw this unanswerable question at you, please. Does this trouble you too?
It troubles all of us.
I know, it's just unanswerable. I can't bear it.
That's exactly
especially, of course, on Erev Yom Kippur.
Right.
Like if Moshe couldn't do it, what does Sandra have that Moshe? In other words, it's just unanswerable.
So let's bring this to its conclusion. And you'll see what do we have that Moshe didn't have.
Thank you.
Ultimately, we don't have an answer to that question, but that's exactly the question that Yonah asked and Eliyahu asked and Moshe asked. And God's answer is, I promise you, that's exactly it. I promise you that there's an efficacy to the concept of prayer and request for rachamim. How it's applied is ultimately in God's hands. That's exactly the point. How it's applied, we don't know. Yonah couldn't understand it. Eliyahu couldn't understand it. Moshe couldn't understand it. If the 3 of them couldn't figure out the formula, they figure out the formula. However, we are told, and that's the purpose of the story, that it is effective, that we have a role, that there's a role for prayer, and there's a role for asking for compassion, and there's a role for quoting the Midot Arachamim, and God's promise that it won't go empty-handed. We don't know how it plays out, but we are given a promise, a brit, that it is effective. It's almost as if the entire story of Yonah, and this is what the Radak says, the entire story of Yonah is God's defense of the ability for people to pray and to ask for rachamim, and to ask for forgiveness. Whether or not we get an answer, the famous joke about God answers all prayers, just doesn't always say yes. And we don't know the answer to every prayer, but we are promised, it's a brit, it's a covenant, it's a contract, that there is an efficacy, a power to the prayer of Rachamim. And that's the key to the whole story. Radak describes it as follows: whatever God says is going to happen that is bad for people. In other words, whatever punishment God threatens people with is always conditional. Im lo yashuvu, if they don't repent. Im yashuvu, if they repent, yislach, will be forgiven. That's part of God's attributes. Even the wicked, even the evil, even the Ra can be forgiven. That's the Midah Rachamim. That's what we say in Yom Kippur. We stand at the beginning of Yom Kippur and we say that we permit prayer with sinners. We say that the entire people, congregation of Israel, are sinning only by accident. We ask for Rachamim. That's what Yom Kippur is all about. That, by the way, is at the end of the day why I think we read Yonah on Yom Kippur. I asked that question the very first year. Why do we read Yonah on Yom Kippur? It's a story of a Navi who runs away. I think the answer is that it's not the story of the Navi who runs away. It's the story of God who defends the efficacy of the attributes of Rachamim and his right, God's right, if you could say that, Kaviyachol, to apply Rachamim where God chooses to. Our job is to pray for. The Radak summarizes this in two places. He says, this is what Yirmiyahu talked about. This is what Yechezkel talks about. Give me the prayer, the quote from Yirmiyahu and from Yechezkel that are part of this story. Yechezkel's in particular is important because we quote this on Yom Kippur also. Yirmiyahu says it in the following way: I may speak about a nation concerning a kingdom and threaten it, that it will be plucked down, broken down, destroyed because of their evil. But if that nation does tshuva, then I will relent, I will take it back, and I will spare them that evil. That's the power of tshuva. Even a nation about which was decreed that they should be destroyed, tshuva is never not an option. Yechezkel similarly has the phrase, do I really want the death of the wicked? I'd rather him repent and live. I don't want the sinner to die. I want him to live and repent and therefore to live. We quote this as part of the davening of Ne'ilah at the end of Yom Kippur. After Yonah, we asked the question at the beginning of the series, why do we read the book of Yonah on Yom Kippur? It's the oddest book to read. It's not because of Yonah and it's not because of Nineveh. The message of the book of Yonah and the maftir that we read at Mincha of Yom Kippur is the efficacy of God's compassion and the assurance that God will defend his right to forgive. That's odd, right? God doesn't have to defend his right, but that's the conflict between God and Yonah. That's the struggle. That's the conversation between God and Yonah. They're having a conversation like God and Eliyahu had a conversation and God and Moshe had a conversation. And God comes out on the side of defending compassion because there's a flip side to judgment. Eliyahu had to come face to face with it. If God punishes everybody who's wicked, right, there's a flip side. Then human beings suffer. So there's a balance. We do not understand that balance. Ata ba'ani. What that balance is purely the domain of God. But our task is to ask for that compassion and to beg God for that compassion because we need it. And we need it more than ever. So that's exactly why the story is so powerful. It's not about the Yonah side of it. It's about the God side of it. We do something fascinating at Maftir Yonah. We finish the entire book, 4 chapters, the longest haftorahs of the year. And we add 3 verses for the book of Micha, the end of it. We add 3 verses. You'll hear it in Shulman Yom Kippur in 2 days' time. You'll listen carefully. You'll hear after we finish the whole book. We add 3 verses from Micha. Miel kamocha neseavon v'pel pesha, who is like your God, who pardons iniquity, passes over the disobedience of the remnant of his heritage. Lo chazik la'adapo, who doesn't retain his anger forever, but delights in loving kindness. But what are these verses? And the answer is, Chazal saw these as Micha's reframing of the 13 attributes of mercy in his own words, meaning there are 13 phrases here, and I've numbered them for you. And each one adds an element to our understanding of the Midot HaRachamim. So we read the whole book of Yonah, and then we tell the whole congregation that the reason we're reading the book of Yonah is not because of Yonah's story, but because of God's story. God will accept the tshuva, even the superficial tshuva of the weak tshuva of the people of Nineveh. If God can accept that tshuva, God will defend his attribute of mercy even for us. And Mincha Yom Kippur is a particularly important time because Chazal say, one of the reasons why Chazal say that the tefillah of Mincha is the most important, that it's a time of din, it's a time of judgment. As the sun begins to set, Mishonotel Redet, Nikra Erev, it's called evening, Humidat din, that's the time of judgment. And so at the day of judgment, Yom HaDin, in Yom Kippur, at the holiest moment, right at Mincha, right before Ne'ilah, when we consider it a time of din, that's when we read the story of Yonah, because the story of Yonah is a story of God defending, chasing after Yonah to defend his attributes of mercy. And if they can be applied to Nineveh and they could be applied to Achav and Izevel, then we come to God and say, then they can be applied to us. And the theme of Ne'ilah in its entirety is the attributes of mercy, the Yud Gimel Midot. So there's no greater, more appropriate, more powerful Haftorah or book of Navi to read than Yonah, precisely because its message is a message about God, not about Yonah, not about the people. It's about God and the Midah of Racham, the attributes of mercy. So I hope that this series will enable us to find greater meaning and depth in the story of Yonah and in our listening to it on Yom Kippur as we do every year. And with that, I will conclude and be happy to spend a few minutes answering questions if
I
there are.
think the
Thank you,
words
thank you.
Ubehema Yaf Gdola describe the big whale that saved Jonah with God's compassion.
Okay, that's also a component of it, the dag, as you say. It's not a whale, that's for sure. What was it is unclear, but never called a whale.
Do you draw any line between Ha'itev Charalach and Lama Charalach with Kayin? Is there a line to draw between Yonah and Kayin?
I'd have to give that thought. I don't know. I'll have to analyze that. I don't want to say yes, I don't want to say no. Yonah and Noach have been compared in a number of places. Yonah and Cain.
The language is so.
The language is there, but that's probably not the only place where charal is used. Charon af is used to describe God's anger. It's a typical term, so its application once doesn't necessarily make it a parallel, but I give that thought.
גמר חתימה טובה ותודה רבה.
Rabbi
Shulman,
Yes,
Khatimat Tova.
I have a comment to make,
sure.
and that is that the Navi says also that Hashem is Borei Hatov uBorei Hara. Once Hashem is Borei Hara, one can understand why he has to have compassion.
Okay, that's a question that needs much longer answer than I can
Obviously,
Right.
I'm just opening a little window of thought.
I'll tell you what. Look, we quote that phrase from Yeshayahu every day, because we paraphrase it. The Navi says, "Yotzer or uvorei choshech, oseh shalom uvorei ra."
Right.
So,
And we say Oborei Takol.
and we create a euphemism out of it, and we say "borei takol."
Correct.
But it's much more than a euphemism. It's actually a reflection of the meaning of the phrase. Meaning, God doesn't create evil. God creates the opportunity to do evil as he creates the opportunity to do good. And so, takol. But the choice of good or evil remains the choice of the human being. So God is not creating the evil. God is creating the opportunity of choice. Man can choose tov or ra. That's a whole different equation. That's on the man side, the human being side of the equation. Where God applies rachamim versus where God applies din, to hold the evil accountable and to forgive the evil or to forgive the sin, right? That's the question that is at the heart of the struggle here. The one thing that I've kind of glossed over is that we tend to jump from the word chet to the word evil. And in the Navi, they're often synonymous, but our concept of tshuva is related, specifically focused on the concept of chet, meaning mistakes. We commit a transgression and mistake. Evil is a much bigger question. A group of people, an individual who is in their core defined as evil, ra, in the truest sense of the term, becomes a much bigger question. The Rambam addresses this in the Laws of Tshuva, where he says that sometimes God can remove from a person or group the right of tshuva because the evil is such that it has to be held accountable. That's essentially applying din rather than racham. And the equation that we're dealing with is we don't know when God applies one or the other. That's exactly the question that the Nevi'im struggle with.
Rabbi,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Why does din tend to be equated with punishment when in fact it's judgment, and judgment can be punishment or not?
Well, if the judgment is one of one is not being, let's call din accountability.
Yeah, I like that better. But I find that it tends to be equated with punishment.
It is, because the alternative, because if a person is good and his judgment is one in which, comes to the mishpat and emerges good, then the whole conversation is moot, because I don't need din or rachamim. If he's deserving, he's deserving. But so in the language of the Navi, in the language of Chazal, certainly the attributes of din and rachamim are opposite ends of the spectrum. So din is synonymous with punishment or accountability, and rachamim is equivalent to sparing, not holding accountable, but being compassionate. That's the short of it. Okay, thank you all for your time. Thank you for listening. Appreciate your.
Fatima Tova, thank you so much.
I'll put in a small selfish plug for our next series, which will be finishing up our book of Yeshua, which will be Bezrat Hashem starting in the fall, and we same time. So hopefully that will about, I would say, probably a couple of 2-3 months of classes on the last half of the book of Yeshua. It's really a standalone piece, so anybody was welcome to join us, and then we'll go from there. All right. Have a
Thank you. Gmar Sina Tova.
Same to
Gmar
you.
Sina Tova.
You will.
Thank you.